North Korea, in this case, would not need any help from North Korea, or from Russia or China, to do a decoupled test, which is easy to do and well within their capabilities. They also could be testing the primary or first stage of a much more powerful two-stage bomb, albeit the second stage is a technical challenge. In the last decades of the Cold War, it is kind of interesting that the U.S. did exactly that to comply with the Threshold Test Ban Treaty. We rarely tested our H-bombs to full yield to comply with not only the TTBT, and because if anything went wrong with the warhead, the problem would most likely be in the primary or first stage. Interestingly, since the Threshold Test Ban of 1974, the United States and the USSR and now Russia has never tested a nuclear weapon over 150 kilotons. Indeed, most tests were far under that level and many were under 10 KT, kilotons. And we have not tested to any yield in the past 20 years because component testing suffices even for our most powerful nuclear weapons. Also, if you go back in history, Russia, China, Britain, and France aren't testing their H-bombs either. Israel developed the H-bomb without testing. South Africa was en route to doing so without testing, but dismantled its arsenal under pressure from the Reagan administration. What the North Koreans could very well have been doing is developing what I call a super EMP weapon. It's designed to produce gamma rays, not a big explosive yield, so it's consistent with all the North Korean tests, including very low yield tests, such as the first 3 kiloton test and 2 other suspected North Korean tests that were sub-kiloton, yet also evidenced traces of tritium. I also would make a point that North Korea has tested 5 weapons, and some people think they have an inventory of 10. Do you think they test half of their entire inventory? If, in fact, they're using a very small amount of nuclear fuel for each of the warheads, the estimates are that they could have anywhere from 25 to 100 warheads. And because a super EMP weapon is low yield, not designed for blast, it can easily be tamped when tested, which would account for the inability to detect any plutonium or uranium from the North Korean tests. Now, one design of a super EMP weapon of Russian origin is purely a fusion weapon, so there would be no or very little plutonium or uranium to detect. Since a super EMP weapon is essentially a very low yield H-bomb, it would be perfectly consistent with North Korean claims. However, let's look at this holistically. We have to remember that North Korea's successful launch now of 2 KSM-3 type satellites looks like what used to be called a fractional orbital bombardment system, which is a Soviet-era ICBM program that would launch a satellite, or in this case a bomb, in the low Earth orbit, but do it in a southerly direction. Isn't it interesting that our satellites and our warning system looks north? Because we always thought the Russians would throw something over the pole. Isn't it interesting that both Iran and North Korea have launched recent ballistic missiles with satellites in a southerly direction where we have absolutely no sensors? And this is precisely the direction from which you would launch a surprise nuclear EMP attack, which would only be practical if the North Koreans had a warhead small enough for delivery by satellite as a super EMP warhead would be. Russian experts, one Chinese military commentator, and South Korean military intelligence all told the EMP Commission that North Korea has super EMP warheads. If you follow the rules for all sources analysis in the intelligence community, that data should not be ignored. And 20 years ago, the North Korean advisory group of the US Congress reported that they were convinced that North Korea was developing nuclear weapons despite the 1994 agreed framework, under which the North Koreans promised not to build such weapons. Yet we now know the advisory group was right, and the critics were wrong. Whether or not ballistic missiles or nuclear weapons are your concern, when you combine the two, it's a deadly, serious threat. And in the face of Iran's tests of nuclear-capable missiles in violation of the UN resolutions, and since North Korea and Iran are strategic partners, in fact have a treaty which compels them to trade missile and military technology, and since both get help from Russia and China, I think it's time to stop wishful thinking that everything is fine, that diplomacy will work, and face reality. That reality that the major media must face and start reporting is North Korea has nuclear missiles that threaten the United States now. Defending the homeland, including the critical electric grid from EMP, is now imperative. What are 10 things which we might think of doing? I know some of you may think these are a little too bold, but one of my friends from the Korean embassy said, when I asked him, why have we responded so little to North Korean terrorist attacks against the United States, Japan, and South Korea? And he turned to me and he said, how many Americans have been killed by the Iranians since 1979? And he knows I knew the answer to that because I tabulated it. 4,692, including over 500 American soldiers. If you read the 9/11 Commission report, you will find that the Iranians trained the hijackers that took the plane and flew it into the World Trade Centers. You don't see that in the news, but what would you do if you were sitting in the White House in January of 2017? First, build effective missile defenses with the Republic of Korea and all our East Asian Pacific allies, including Aegis, THAAD, Patriots, and our own national missile defenses. I would even call up the Israelis and ask them about Iron Dome. Congress can fund it. ROC, the Republic of Korea, Japan, and our allies in the Pacific can follow suit. We can match funding and cooperation. 2, we could expand the Proliferation Security Initiative, which now has over 100 members, to interdict technology transfers to the DPRK and from the DPRK. That will require some formal arrangements with some of the members to work towards specific goals and metrics to stop North Korean trade in W&D missile technology. 3rd, we could stop all trade between the DPRK, the Republic of Korea, Japan, and declare the DPRK a terror-sponsoring country, which it is. This could be implemented through sanctions on the Republic of Korea or Japan entities that do business directly or indirectly with North Korea, and including American companies. In fact, our sanctions against Burma exceed those on North Korea. 4th, we could prohibit the use of the American banking system by any country or business or any entity doing business with the Democratic People's Republic, I hate to say that, it's North Korea, and any entity, and much as we did with the Banco Delta in 2005. We could also designate North Korea as a counterfeit and money laundering center, which it is. The Treasury Department says it is, but we haven't designated it. This could be initiated by U.S. sanctions legislation contained in the National Defense Authorization Act or the Homeland Security funding legislation. It could also be chartered in the Office of the U.S. Treasury Department, which is established solely to undertake such measures. We can enhance the U.S., Republic of Korea, Japan, Taiwan deterrent military forces by adopting a complementary 5- and 10-year modernization program, call it the $15 billion Pacific Pivot, fund together for defense priorities. We can match U.S. FIDIP modernization plans adopted by Congress with those of our Pacific allies. 6th, in particular, I've always been struck by why we don't roll up and shut down the network of North Korean diplomats that sell drugs, date rape prescriptions, and steal military secrets, all of which is designed to get hard currency for the North Korean regime. What about stopping all U.S. airline service of any kind to any plane that lands or flies in and out of North Korea? What about laying out, just to get their attention, how American or allied military power could be used to hold at risk and or when necessary or if necessary to destroy all North Korean nuclear facilities? We could also prohibit North Korea landing rights on any Asian or U.S. soil territory of any chartered plane or commercial airline that lands in that country. And we could use that to prevent their quote-unquote diplomats from engaging in drug contraband and technology smuggling. We could also blockade maritime trade with the DPRK that's non-humanitarian until North Korea verifiably and permanently ceases its nuclear and missile programs and proliferation activities. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Peter. Stay right there, please. Before we open the floor, quick question. Did you say Doug Banville is the far right? Or
Libertarian right. He's so far, I have a former Senator, Malcolm Wallach, and excuse me for being a little off color, but Malcolm said the left is so far left and the right is so far right, their butts are touching. But in this case, Doug is touching Larry Korb. They're both, I mean, talk about, if you want to start a war on the Korean Peninsula, advocate the withdrawal of American forces, which is precisely North Korea's objective. And you know that from a good deal of intelligence from that. So my view is we've now seen, because of the test by North Korea, we have seen not only that, but in the national interests, in War is Boring, which is a website, in breaking defense and other defense rags, articles and essays written by people advocating that the U.S. completely withdraw its military forces from the Republic of
Okay,
Greece.
stay right there. Larry, you have something? Yes.
Very interesting presentation. I would ask Mr. Husey a little bit more about this concept of North Korea exploding a nuclear weapon within a satellite in the atmosphere. Could you go into a little bit more detail about what the effects would be?
Okay.
I heard that in the fourth quarter of the Super Bowl, and that was in Los Angeles, right?
No,
San
San Francisco.
San Francisco, excuse me, San Francisco.
California.
The North Korean satellite passed directly over the stadium where the Super Bowl was ending up. If North Korea did explode a nuclear weapon in the high atmosphere, could you go into a little bit more detail about what the effects would be on the U.S. electrical
A
grid?
satellite launches.
That would be my first question.
A satellite is, if a warhead on a satellite at that level of 500,000 feet was exploded, it's not going to have any effect on land. It's too far. But an EMP would, the optimum place is 30 to 70 kilometers. And you could do that off of a freighter, a couple hundred kilometers off the coast of North Carolina. You could launch it and the jihadis could scuttle the freighter and go and get 72 mermaids, and you wouldn't know who did it. In fact, the Russians told us back in 1999, a group of congressional members, that this led to the EMP Commission being created. The Russians were particularly unhappy with what we were doing in Serbia, and they said, you know, you've been treating us like garbage since the end of the Cold War, and we could launch a nuclear warhead off of a submarine off your coast. You wouldn't know who did it. We could detonate it at 60 kilometers above the Earth's surface and take out your electric grid for decades. The problem is our electrical grid has a lot of SCADAs in it and computer chips, which would be fried by two things. The sun can do an EMP attack, and unfortunately you can't negotiate with the sun. About every 100 years it does one of these major attacks. Years ago when it happened, it didn't matter. We had vacuum tubes and we had a country, and in 1840 was the last once, and then 1930s. But with our current computer systems, the entire electrical grid just shuts down. We don't have 6,000 transformers sitting in a shed somewhere to replace them. We have maybe a couple dozen. They're made by A and B company. They're made by Germans, South Koreans, and Japan. There's a 5 to 8 year wait to build them, because these are, some of them are twice as big as this room. And the EMP Commission was twice created by Congress, and twice it reported unanimously that an EMP, either from the sun or nuclear, both of which would shut down the industrial society of the United States and return us to the economy of the 1830s. When Newt Gingrich said that back in 2012 during the campaign, he was ridiculed, but the Wall Street Journal, to its credit, did an editorial saying they looked at the data and he was 100% correct. You're talking about wiping out America. Now, isn't it interesting, when we went to the Israelis, they said, you're kidding. Nah, it can't be true. He said, you are a one nuclear weapon country. One goes off 70 miles above Tel Aviv, your grid goes down. They looked at it, they said, you're right, they fixed it. The European private sector is way ahead of our private sector. They're actually taking action to do that. Trent Franks from Arizona, the congressman, and Doug Lamborn from Colorado, as well as Yvette Clarke from Brooklyn, head of the Black Caucus. You can't get two people further apart than Yvette Clarke and Trent Franks. Both dear friends, both EMP advocates, EMP protection advocates. And they both have urged, and the House has passed now 4 times unanimously, legislation to protect the grid. Now you have to basically spend between $4 and $6 billion one time over a period of years to protect the grid. Now, isn't it interesting is that every day the utilities have to power down the grid to deal with solar radiation on a day-to-day basis. It doesn't harm anybody, but if you left the grid up, it would. So they gotta power down the grid. It's like your lightning rod on your house. These are mild lightning strikes. By doing that, they then have to go buy power at the margin, at the spot market. And I've asked the utility industry, in fact, I'm debating them tomorrow night in Prince William County, how much does this cost? And for you to buy in the spot market, they said about 2% of the cost of electricity in America comes to $8 billion a year. We spend $406 billion, utilities do buying electricity, whether it's coal or geothermal or wind or whatever. I said, okay, you spend $8 billion and I can spend $6 billion to stop it. Once, you make, on your $6 billion investment, you make $8 billion. You could give that some back to the ratepayers, some back to the states. You could actually protect the grid against cyber, which is equally bad, because you know the Russians just shut down Ukraine. They shut down, tried to shut down Jordan, Israel, among other countries. So you have to do cyber, solar, and nuke. And there's a book by Newt Gingrich and William Fortune called 1 Second After. It's about a North Carolina town that goes and is impacted by an EMP attack. It's a brilliant book. Now he's written a sequel. I think it's 1 month later. What would happen? Okay? Our grid was built to get electricity to people quickly. That's what rural electrification was. That's what it was. Hey, they did the job they were told to do. The problem is with cyber and solar and nuke threats, the grid is built entirely the wrong way. You wouldn't want to build it this way. So what do we got to do? We got to retrofit. Basically, the gizmos that you can do are produced by companies like A&B or Primus. You pour a cement slab, you put them next to the transformer, you bolt it down, you go home. And acts as like a big lightning rod.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Any follow-up?
Couple of, one point and one additional question. First of all, Mr. HVC is exactly right about North Korea having nuclear warheads already on